He's flown down from Delhi, and he is very active in the speaker community. He recently gave a talk at the React. Was it React or was it React Native?
It was React Native.
It was React Native event held in Bangalore. So yeah, he is. Okay, I need to do a browser for him.
Hi everyone, I'm Ekansh. Awesome. How many of you write code? Show of hands. Cool, perfect. Great audience. So I've been to events where people come to eat pizzas, and that's cool. But like a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be very code focused. It's going to be overarching themes of how to write software, how to write low code, and for this particular talk, I try to focus on how exactly do you go down to like writing code actually to like achieve these things. Like we have abstract concepts like low code, we have composability, we talked about abstractions, we talked about all of these things, but what does it come down when you actually start to write code? Awesome, thanks Suraj. Hopefully if that works, great. So I'm Ekaansh, I'm a developer advocate at Agora. Just for context, Agora builds video software, so if you want to do virtual live streaming, we sort of build SDKs for that. I'll reference that in my slides so that just throwing that out there. I also am a JavaScript nerd, so there'll be a few examples from JavaScript. How many of you know JavaScript? Perfect. How many of you know HTML? Cool. We have HTML as well, so awesome. You can follow me on Twitter. I'll post the slides when I figure out how to deploy them. But let's come back pace and talk about slow code. So I tried looking for a definition on the internet, and I wasn't satisfied, so I built my own, like any software developer. So I call it abstractions to simplify the user design when you're interacting with something, right? So my slides are having some issues, but hopefully that fixes itself. So abstractions to simplify the developer experience that let you focus on things that matter. It sounds very Steve Jobsy, but the idea is that it's a layer of abstraction to simplify the developer experience. That's all you need to know. To give you a quick example, so we execute assembly code. Like you saw, only like 3 people write assembly code. So what we did, we built high-level languages on top of them. How many of you write a high-level language? All of you, right? So that's what we've been using. And the natural progression was building frameworks. So for example, you had Node.js come out, and then we built Express on top of that to sort of make handling requests easier. And to me, the next natural progression from frameworks is low code. And that might sound like a stretch, but I'll talk about that in just a second. So at Agora, what we're doing is we're building video calls for people, we're empowering people to build video applications. And traditionally, we've seen people write thousands of lines of code to build these things. And what we've done is we've sort of taken that down to one single React component that you can just plug in, and it just builds the whole layout for you, it does everything for you. And it sort of takes some configuration, you can do callbacks, all of that. But that's where these other companies that you can take inspiration from come in, right? These are big companies doing almost exclusively in the low-code space, and naturally there's WordPress right on top. So let's talk about that for a second. Cool. So why low code? To get you interested into this talk, let's look at this Gartner report which says that by 2024, 2 years from now, all software application development will be 65% low code based. That metric is huge, right? And according to me, WordPress is still king. So if you don't agree, there's a tweet by Swix. He's a super smart guy who sort of took metrics, and almost half the internet is running WordPress right now. So even though you might hate PHP, that's what's powering like half of the internet. And each year it's growing by like 3-4%, and it's not stopping anytime soon. So hopefully that gives you context on what low code is sort of achieving. And now let's talk about how we can do low code things. So we'll think about developer experience. We'll see how low code first design is built. And then we'll sort of get into the API patterns that I mentioned. So if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, is that extensibility is #1 key thing that you should care about. So naturally, what a lot of things that people were building with low code. The problem was you build something with low code, there's a feature that the low code solution doesn't provide, and then you throw out the entire solution, go back to the SDK, you go back to writing code in the lower level language. For example, if Express doesn't let you do something, you have to write Node.js, which isn't a great experience. So extensibility is the key metric to be successful in my opinion. There's a tweet about how you start editing this WordPress theme, and you're just going to change some CSS, and you're going to be like, I'm just going to make the squares rounded and everything's going to be fine, and accidentally you're writing WordPress PHP for 8 to 10 years. And that's sort of what we're trying to achieve, and that's sort of what the strength of WordPress is. So, talking code, right? Let's say there's a low-code instance where you provide some config and lets you do something very easily in one line of code. At all times, you should be able to access the underlying layer. You should be able to access the underlying SDK, the underlying framework, the underlying platform APIs to do something that low-code doesn't let you do. And hopefully you can maintain the state of the application during this. So even though you might not have built a feature that's possible with low-code, your users will build it for you. People are willing to write code, it's just that you're trying to empower them with the right tools. So to give you an example, this is what SwiftUI does to sort of build image filters. So if you want to do some image filtering, there's 4 lines of code that you write, and it gives you a well-filtered image. Behind the scenes, it's doing all the calculations for applying these pixel values to different filters and stuff like that. But what if there's a filter that doesn't exist in the framework yet? Are you logged out? Do you just stop using SwiftUI and move to something else? No, you can always access the underlying pixel data for that image, and then even though that's not the direct way to do things, they want you to use the inbuilt filters, but you can still access the underlying layer, the underlying image data, and then do whatever you want. So it also does something nice where it tells you that this is an unsafe mutable pointer, which sounds really scary. So that's not your direct way to do things, but it also allows you to do what you want to do. So don't limit the users, basically. And what we try to do with what sort of API we've sort of done is with React, you render a component, but at any point you can write JavaScript to access the underlying SDK, and hopefully that's visible, but essentially you can extract this client from the context, and let's say you want to add virtual backgrounds that just came out in the SDK and we haven't added to the low-code solution, you can still call the SDK method and then it will all just work out because we maintain the state. So moving on to a different example and improving developer experience. How many of you have Vercel? Okay, a few hands. So what Vercel allows you to do is deploy websites on the cloud, and what it does really well is it usually is you enter one command, you hit enter 4 times, and you have a live website. But what I want to stress on is these smart defaults that it builds for you are opinionated, but at every point you are allowed to override them. You don't have to go into a config to define these things. It asks you each step of the way that, hey, I decide this, does this make sense? And you can override them, and it's just golden standard for developer experience in my opinion. Cool. Coming back to code. When you're building something low code, you're building abstractions to abstract away code from the user, right? So let's say there's a task which you want to achieve, which takes step A to step F. Would you bundle it all together into just one function which does everything for the user? The odds are with low code, that's probably what you want to do. But with all things, you probably want to strike a balance, right? So it might make sense that the first 4 methods are something that makes sense and group together nicely. The last 2 are something that don't. And then you sort of have given the user flexibility enough to execute things in between. So they do A, B, C, D, they do something by themselves, make a network call, whatever, and then they come back to EF. But that's sort of cutting with flexibility, right? So how do you go one level further? That's where user access to events comes in. Most languages support events. I come from JavaScript, so that's sort of how we do things. Events, callbacks, similar things, where you can bundle together ENF, but what you do is you emit an event when you're executing these functions away from the user. So you abstracted this away from the user, but you emit an event. And the user can hook into this event and execute code that they want. Does that make sense? Cool. Because this is something that it took me a while to wrap my head around how events work, and it's just so powerful, and it can give you so much flexibility, and it's just the right way to do things in my opinion when you're building low-code things, right? Cool, this is some examples you can look at later. And this also allows you to give data back to the user. So usually what you're trying to do is there's some input, you do some processing, and you give some output. But with low code, what we see is you can provide a config to give that input and customize the experience. But you also want to give the data back to the user, give them access to your state, and give them access to events. So, for example, in the case of video call, this would be, let's say a user comes in, there's a pre-built UI, but you want to display a pop-up, you want to display a toast, you want to do a network call, you want to add it to your database. You give them access to this event for them to sort of extend that functionality to what they want to achieve. This lets you execute side effects, which I sort of mentioned. This is how it works in JavaScript, this is how we do it. When you click the end call button in a video call, let's say you're on a website, there's 7 different things you might want to do. You might want to redirect them to a new page, you might want to show them a pop-up, you might want to show them an entirely new component, you might want to clean up something that you've done, you want to finish a network call. So we are not opinionated on what the end call button does. We just give you a method that you can pass in a function to, and we just execute that function. So you can do whatever you want when that button is clicked, even though that button is not part of your code. It's something that I maintain as the library maintainer. Cool. That was a heavy topic, so we'll come to framework-specific design. So this is what Swift UI looks like, and I keep going back to it because it's very different from JavaScript, where you have some view and you chain these properties next to it, and it all works really nice. It works really well together. So if you're coming from Swift UI and you're writing HTML, you're writing React, it sort of looks very similar to the API on top, right? You'll be very tempted to define an attribute called padding and then pass in a value in HTML. But this isn't the way to do things. And why I say this is because React has its own way of applying padding to it, right? When you do this, you're sort of forcing the user to learn your own new API. And we don't want to learn things, right? We want to use whatever we've already learned. So this is how React does things. And if you can conform to the framework standards, you just have a much better developer experience. You'll have a much better, like, if I write this and your component doesn't support this, I will be so frustrated, right? And if I write this and it just works, it's delightful. So I don't have to learn anything new. So try to work between the bounds of your framework. But there's also ways to escape from the framework's bounds, essentially. I picked this definition from these docs, which were really cool. So it talks about how an escape hatch is an intentional leak in the abstraction, and it allows users to escape to a lower layer, right? So what that means is it's time for a quick question. So how many of you used Visual Basic? How many of you are old enough to have used Visual Basic? Cool. I started writing code at a very young age, so I was fortunate enough to have gone through this torment of a framework or whatever this build is. So this gave us something that's really cool, and I want to talk about that. So you know what escaping a string character is, right? If not, we're going to talk about it. So this is how you write a string in that language that I specified. And what if you want to add 2 quotes in your string, right? So this is what Microsoft Visual Studio, whatever, tried to do it. It just said that add 2 quotes and I'll just escape the first one. So it's not traditionally an escape hatch, but what I'm trying to specify is this is something you're probably familiar with, where you add a backslash and it escapes the next character. And this is sort of the mutually agreed upon way to escape strings. And this is a fixed pattern. You write a string between quotes, but you can escape from it if you really need to, right? What I want to tell you is that, let's say you don't know React, but then it's a framework which builds declarative UI using an imperative API, that's your HTML. So with HTML, you're always traditionally trying to manipulate the DOM, that's your website, you're trying to manipulate the tree that is built, right? And what you're trying to do is give it instructions, like I want to select this element and remove this element from the tree. What React tries to do is it tries to abstract that away from you. You just tell it that, hey, I want to render this. It figures out the way to build that UI, like pull out the element, insert the new element, that flexibility, that freedom that HTML provides. So React still follows a declarative pattern, but it gives you access to an API called dangerously set in your HTML, where you can still imperatively write code that would be injected to your DOM, and then React wouldn't care about it. So even though React is really famous, it's like the leading framework, it still sort of goes back to its roots, where it tells you that, hey, I'm going to give you the tools to do whatever you want. This is probably not something you'd like to do, but if nothing else works, you can. So that freedom is what I think has been really, really important. And moving on to taxonomy from React is, hooks came out 4 years ago, and this tweet from last 2 months back has still been arguing like, hey, we shouldn't call this method this, we should call it this instead. So if these guys can argue for like 4 years, you can spend 5 minutes to decide what the API method should be called, right? Because that just causes so much frustration. And to give you an example, dangerously set emulation will sound scary because it needs to. I picked these straight away from Swift docs, which are, I mean, one of the best docs that I've seen. I'm gonna skip through the first two because of time, but let's take a look at this example. If you want to remove an element from an array, remove makes sense as a method on the API. But when we say remove zero, am I removing 0th element or am I removing the entry 0? It's not obvious, right? So if you just rename it to remove at 0, so much better. It's just I was delighted to see this. But don't define a 3-word, 7-word method, because if you have a view, it's very obvious that you're trying to remove an element because that's all it takes. There's no confusion here. So you try to be as concise as possible, but in my humble opinion, if you're in doubt, be as explicit as you can. It's okay if you have auto completion now, everyone can write like that big method call, it's fine. Just be as explicit, it's gonna avoid headaches. So that nicely ties into documentation in docs. I like writing inline docs, and there's no way for me to convince you. I'll give you an example of you coming back to project, you look at your code, you're like, who wrote this absolute trash? And then you do git blame, and then you see your username from like 2 weeks ago. It's the most humbling experience in a developer's life that you've grown so much in like 2 weeks or a month that you find your own code written like absolutely trash, whatever. So this is a cool code. We has met the enemy and the enemy is us. So even if you're not writing documentation for other people, write for yourself. Just write inline comments to your methods and you're just gonna have a great time. I'll leave you with this comic that you can look at. When you're building documentation, try to make it as simple as possible. If your documentation needs a documentation on how to read the documentation, you're probably doing something wrong. Cool. So we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to talk about Evan Yu is the creator of Vue.js. He tweeted this I think last month, and last week actually, and I saw this and I was like, exactly. So he talks about how it's frustrating when you can't fix things that like you go to npm and you monkey patch some dependency because it isn't working again, and it sort of brings insight into that developers are willing to write code even for libraries or frameworks that are supposed to work, right? They're willing to fix things for you, but you should empower them to do that. Like you shouldn't lock them away. Hey, you made a network call, I'll just give you a bad error. Like you have no idea what to do now. So error handling. Write descriptive error messages, error codes. Error description should be ARI5. Explain it like they're a 5-year-old. Be as explicit as possible. Everyone's gonna have a great time. Try to handle user errors for them. For example, one thing I realized that's still broken in the UI kit is if someone doesn't have a microphone and they try to use the UI kit, it just sort of breaks because like I didn't anticipate that people don't have microphones, which is a common thing, right? So that's something I'm gonna fix. But then I want to show you how you can use patterns to show functions that can error. This is so cool. With JavaScript or with any sort of async language, you have functions that can return a promise or which can like fail or succeed based on some things that's usually a network call or whatever. So you sort of have a try catch block. Some Python does it as well. But what if a user just does this? If they succeed, great, everything works. If you throw an error, everything just breaks. And I've seen this code everywhere. Like this is not uncommon. This is sort of what Apollo does for GraphQL, where they give you two properties from that method. So you get an object which contains data and error, and it's sort of really obvious that this thing can error out, right? Just create API design. I'm gonna move on to C++, where or just any language, but I wanted to like do a polyglot thing where I wanted to look cool. So as an example from C++, where if you're trying to do a string compare between strings that are different case and different capitalization, it will fail. And that's probably not what you want when you're doing like method calls and you're just picking selectors. Just use enums instead. They're better for memory, they're better for users, they're better for everyone. It's a language feature. You're not building anything on top. Just use enums, they're great. With JavaScript, I've seen people run into this problem where you can stanchiate something from the library and you put it on the library's instance or the object. And sometimes you're overriding things and you're overriding object properties. And it can cause so many issues when you're using things like jQuery. If you've been old enough to use jQuery, it's just so easy to fix that. You just build a getter function which returns that value, and now TypeScript will error out when you try to do something like this. And even if it doesn't error out, this just doesn't make sense. Why would you want to change a function to a value? So it's a long example, but it's just using getter functions in a language which doesn't traditionally use them. Like Java does it, but JavaScript isn't traditionally known to use getters and setters. But it's a powerful feature we built in other languages that you can learn from and adapt to different frameworks or different languages. So, quick bonus: if you're building pre-built UI, this is something I learned the hard way. Is different frameworks, different platforms work differently. So what an alert box looks on iOS is very different from what looks on Android and the web. This is why I like React Native a lot and don't enjoy Flutter as much. That's a controversial take, but it's something that you should take care of when you're building UI for people. And try to keep your dependencies lean. Quick side note: we built something and everything that we wrote was perfect, like any developer, but our library broke and production went down. So it was a simple thing that we could have just abstracted away and built ourselves, and it would just have avoided so much headache. So try to keep your dependencies lean. If you're using there's this NPM module called isFalse, which just tells you if a number is false or if a value is false, and just don't use that. It has like 500,000 stars or 500,000 downloads on NPM or something like that. Just absurd. I'll end with this tweet by Westboss, which basically reads out: JavaScript is great until you see the PHP guys with lab notes. So low code is the future, even if that's not something we've started building in India at least. I think it's great, has great potential, and that's what I want to leave you with. Thanks for your time. Make cool things, to inspire cool things, and that's me. Any questions? We still have like a minute left. Yes.
So, you talked about using minimum dependencies, right? But from what I understand, low code is sort of dependencies which you are using and which is sort of contradicting. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Great question. When I say use little dependencies, I mean as a library builder that other people will consume, your dependencies should be lean. But when an application developer is building something for the users, like actual customers, then they can use like dependencies, because then you're sort of building for a customer and you sort of maintain and own your code base. With libraries, what you're trying to do is be bulletproof. You don't want someone else's product to fail because your library, a dependency in your library failed. Does that make sense?
Another question I had is that another question I had is that although I have not used low code, but the general sentiment I have seen in the industry overall, like if you have something which is starting and which when you are testing waters, then people tend to use low code a lot. But something which is full throttle and a lot of different components are there, people generally tend to stay away from low code technologies which are there. So what low code can do to solve such problems, and what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think that's sort of what the overarching theme of my presentation was, and you put it brilliantly. Where you start with low code, and then you're like, now I want to get serious. I'll just like go down to the deeper level. But we don't have that mindset with frameworks, right? Entire billion-dollar companies are built on top of like Express, for example. And that's what we sort of have to achieve. With low code, we have to make it extensible enough that you never think twice when you're using low code. You're like, anything I would want to do would be possible because I can access the underlying layer, or I can access the underlying abstraction. So that's sort of what I mentioned in the first slide. When you're trying to build something extensible, you need to give people access to the underlying platform or the underlying layer or the underlying framework. So with Node.js, you can always access the system API to write files, for example, or read files, for example. And it's opinionated in a sense where it will tell you that, hey, I'm trying to use UTF-8 to do encoding by default. But you can specify, hey, I just want to read binary files. So it doesn't limit you in the sense that, hey, I just want to throw Node.js out and I'm just going to build my own framework to, do my own backend or whatever. You use Django, you use these things that are built on top, which build abstractions, but still give you a way to like access the underlying people as. So you don't write assembly anymore, right? Like that's gone. That's gone away. But at some point, have you ever figured that, hey, I would probably, have to throw this out and write assembly? That's never the case. So that's what we should strive for when we're writing low-code solutions. Anyone else? Cool. Thanks, guys.